Welcome back to the sixth part of the JavaScript Basics course. If you haven't seen the first parts, you might want to check those out first. The link for those are in the description, along with the starter code for this lecture. In the last part, we talked all about switch statements and conditionals, and in this part, we're going to talk about functions. So if you're ready, grab yourself a cup of tea and let's get started. So what are functions? Functions can be explained as a block of executable code, kind of like a set of instructions for the computer. Inside the function, you can do things already discussed like declare variables, if statements, and even declare more functions and things like that. So here's what a function looks like. You declare the function with the function keyword. Then you name your function, whatever you want, followed by parentheses and curly brackets. Then your code that you want to run goes in between those curly brackets. And for this to run, you actually need to call the function. So below you can see we have some name and parentheses. No curly brackets, just some name, parentheses. And finish it off with a semicolon like we do in JavaScript. And this will then run the function. Without the bottom part, without the some name brackets, the function won't run. It'll be there, but it won't run. So let's jump into our code and make a function. So let's make a console log that's a bit fancier. So we're going to start with the function keyword, followed by the name of our function. So let's call this fancy log. Our parentheses, open and close, and curly brackets. So this is our function. So let's type a console.log. And in our console log, let's do a load of stars, a load of asterisks. And then we want console.log a message. So obviously using quotes as well. Hello. Finish off with a semicolon. And we're just going to copy the first console log we did and put it below hello. So we should have now a nice little fancy log message. And if I save, you can see, because we're running live reload like usual, when I save, it doesn't do anything, and that's because we haven't called fancy log. So let's do that now. Let's call fancy log, parentheses, and our semicolon, and save, and you'll see that now, because we've called a function, it appears in our console. Before, with if-else statements without functions, they were just running from the start. Functions need to be called to run. So now functions can have arguments. Now arguments are passed into the function in the brackets, straight brackets, our parentheses, and can be used in the function itself. So let's show you that. So in our fancy log, we can send something into our function. So the way we do that is, in our parentheses, when we call the function, we could put a string in there. So let's put a string of hello world in there. Let's go basic, shall we? So now, for the function to receive it, we need to put something in our brackets up here, and it's almost like a variable name. We can call this anything. So we could call this arg for argument. Now if I save that, we're still getting the same thing because we're not using this argument yet. It's available in the function, but we're not using it. So let's clear out the hello. If we just put arg in here and give that a save, you can see now hello world. So we're passing in a string because it's in quotes, and we're saying refer to it as arg. So you're going to have this string. It's called arg. It's like a variable, so you can then use it. And we can even manipulate this argument. So let's use a JavaScript method that we can use on strings to make it all uppercase. So let's go up here and let's put it in a variable. So var result. You don't have to do this, but it's cleaner, equals our arg dot to capital U, because you're using camel case, upper capital C case, so to uppercase, parentheses, because we're calling something, and there you go. So what's happened here is to uppercase is a method. It's kind of like a function that's built into JavaScript itself that we can use to help us do things. So this is like a pre-built function, and we're basically saying take the argument, so we know that is hello world. So take the argument and make it uppercase and store that in the results variable. So now if we just put in this console log here, if we put in the result, can give it a save, and now it's saying hello world because we have created a variable called result, and we've said save the argument made to uppercase, and then console log it here. Okay, so let's create another function. We're just going to delete this whole thing. And same again, start with a function keyword, and we're going to make a multiplier. So call this multiplier, and parentheses, curly brackets, that's our basic function. Now what we're going to do with this one, we're going to pass in 2 arguments. And the way we do that is we call our function with its name, multiplier, and our parentheses, finish it off with a semicolon. And you can just pass in arguments spaced with a comma here. So let's say we want to multiply 12 by 4. So 2 values here. Then in our function, we can just name those values. So let's call them arg1 and arg2. Again, this can be any name. So then now we can pick up these values in our function. So just to show you that, we can console.log arg1. And it will give us 12 because that's argument 1. Okay? Let's get rid of that console log. And what we're going to do is we're going to multiply them. So let's create a result variable. And again, this can be called anything. Result equals arg1 multiplied by arg2, semicolon to finish the line. And then we can console.log the result. There you go, 48. If we change it to 10, we can see 40. So this is now a function that's helping us multiply. We can also have default values for our arguments. If you went to arg1, you can do an equal sign, and you could say equal to 2, for instance, and arg2 could be equal to 4. So now what that's saying is, when I save it's still the same, but we're saying if we don't pass any values in here, we have defaults, so we'll use those defaults. If we didn't have values here, we would see not our number because it's not getting a number, so it can't multiply these 2 together because it isn't receiving them in the first place. So the next thing we're going to look at is scope. So I'm just going to jump into the code on this one because I think it's better in practice than actually trying to explain it. Now I'm going to create a function to wake us up. So we have a wake up function, parentheses, curly brackets. Then obviously we need to call that wake up function like so. So what we can do is above our function, we're going to create some variables called eyes open. We'll set that to false because we're asleep. And we're going to say var teeth clean, and they're not because we are yet to go to the bathroom and clean our teeth. So when wake up runs, we want to set these both to true. So let's say eyes open is equal to true, so we're setting it to true. So we're changing the value, and teeth clean is also going to be set to true. What happens now is we haven't console logged anything out. So if I go into our console on our browser, and if I say eyes open, hit that, that's set to true. That's because we've already called a function, right? So if I comment out the code that calls a function and try that again, eyes open, false. So when it starts, eyes open is false. Then we change it to true by calling the function like so, and it changes to true. Now what happens if I have a variable inside here called showered and set that equal to, let's say, true. Now if I call showered in here, showered is not defined. And the reason for that is because of scope. If showered, if I cut it out and move it to the top, if showered is here, and I call showered again, you can see we are getting true. So that's interesting. This is global scope. So before, when showered was inside our function, this is what's called function scoped. So everything in global scope, everything basically in the document that's not wrapped in some kind of function or anything like that, that can be used by everything in that document. However, function scoped variables can't be seen by the outside world. So if we were to get this output into the console, we could do it like this, console.log showered, because we're calling this console.log from our wake up function. So it does have access to that variable. So if I save that, we have true. However, if I'm outside, I'm just going to copy this console log outside here, give that save. It can't find it because it's inside the function. So you can go that way, you can go from global scope to function scope, but not the opposite way. Now, functions can also call other functions from within inside them. So let's have a little look at this. So I'm just going to remove showered here altogether. And let's say we now want to make a cup of coffee. So we call wake up and we have our wake up function. So let's create another function above called make coffee. Parentheses, curly brackets. And what make coffee does is, first of all, we're going to double our coffee. So we're going to have some coffee options because we need to know if we're going to have sugar and if we're going to have milk. So let's call our function from within inside wake up. So make coffee. So now we're calling this function. So we're calling wake up. Wake up sets these to true. Then it calls another function called make coffee. And we can see that in work here. Console.log make coffee. So we can see that wake up is now calling make coffee. So we can compartmentalize different things that are doing different jobs. We don't want to mess up our components if it's doing a different task. So I'm just going to remove that console log. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically create an alert that tells us our coffee's been made. So let's create an alert with a string. And we're going to say how many milliliters. So 200 milliliters of coffee is made. Okay. So you can see 200 milliliters of coffee is made. So let's say now we want to use arguments to alter things in here. So let's create an object. So we're going to go right to the top, right in the global scope, create a variable called coffee options. We're going to set that equal to curly brackets. So we're now creating an object. So we can name things. So we're going to create a volume, colon, and we're going to say 100 milliliters. So 100, so that's a number. Milk, I'm going to set that to true. So these are our settings, our options for our coffee. And we're going to say cup. I'm going to tell what cup I want, and that's a string. So I want the doggy cup. Okay, so finish off that with a semicolon after the curly brackets. There we go. So what do we need to do now? Well, wake up is calling make coffee. So we can pass in coffee options to make coffee because it's global scope, right? So let's copy the name and pass in this object to the make coffee function. Now we know to be able to use it, we need to kind of create its own variable, its own name. So I'm just going to shorten it to options because we don't need the full name. So now, I'm just going to comment this out just to show you this. If I console.log options, you can see now we have this volume 100, milk, true, cup, doggy. I can even pull it down and see it like this. So we now know make coffee is getting those options, which are passed in here. So wake up is called, it sets these to true, then it runs make coffee, passing in this coffee options. Can you see how it's going up and down? Then we're getting the options in here and we're console logging that out. Perfect. So I'm just going to remove that console log. So what we want to do now is we always want to double our coffee because we always know that we need more. So let's create a variable inside our function called double coffee and set that to options.volume. So we're using dot notation to go into our options, which is technically coffee options, and going down to the volume. So we're getting the volume here from the options, and we're going to times that by 2, semicolon. So now console.log double coffee, we can see it's 200 rather than 100. Perfect. So we want to know if our coffee's got milk or not. So in our alert, I'm just going to remove this console log again. We can replace 200 with our double coffee. So let's do that. So we want to start with the word double coffee plus a string. So this is going to concatenate 200 with this sentence here, this string. 200 mils of coffee is made. Right, so we want to say 200 mils of coffee is made with or without milk. So at the moment we've got milk. So we can use an if statement for this. So first we're going to create a variable called milk. And we're going to set it to nothing. We're going to basically say an empty string. Then we can say if the options dot milk, so if options object milk item is true, so we can say is true like this, or we can just leave that off because we know it's trying to evaluate this to true to see if this is true, and it does that automatically. Curly brackets. If that is true, we can then set the milk variable to equal a string called with milk. So I'm going to show you what I'm doing here. So I'm going to add milk to our alert. So 200 milliliters of coffee with milk. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to put another quote here, plus milk, plus, and another quote mark. So we're basically having to break out the quotes. And when we want to add a variable, we need to add another quote mark, add the plus symbol to concatenate. Then when we're finished with our variable, the plus symbol again, then start the quote again to go back to a string. So if I save that now, we can see 200 milliliters of coffee with milk is made. So we need to do space here and save again. And you can see with milk. Now if the milk is false, you can see 200 milliliters of coffee is made. And we're just going to sort out some of the spacing like this. This should fix it for us. 200 milliliters of coffee is made, no milk. Now, if we didn't do it like this, if we thought, oh, we can just leave this empty, you can see undefined. So we need to give it an empty string variable because we're using it as part of the sentence here. And now let's say we're going to get our cup. And we're going to uppercase it and add it to the end. So let's create a variable called cup and set that equal to options.cup because we're looking in our object for the cup. And we say .to uppercase like we did previously. Let's do plus an exclamation mark as well. And now we can add the cup to our string. Is made in our space plus then our variable called cup. That should say doggy cup. Right. I'm just going to close this. Let's give this a save. 200 mils of coffee is made in our doggy cup, all in uppercase. Great. So next up I want to talk about return statements. Now return statements can pass something back to where it was called. So if we return something from our function, we can then use it at the point of where it's called. Return statements will also break out of that function, out of that particular part of the function in the code. and it will not execute anything below it. Okay, so let's create a function called doMaths. And we can call doMaths here. And what we want to do is we want to pass in a couple of numbers that we can do maths on. So let's do 22 and 10. So now doMaths is called, and if we say arg1, arg2, we can now get these numbers in this function here. So what we can do is we can, if we go above doMaths, we want to do a couple of sums here. So let's create another function called multiplier, and it's going to take in 2 arguments as well, so we can just call it the same, arg1, arg2. That's fine for now. And what we're going to do now is we're going to return this. So the doMaths function here is going to call multiplier. So let's say multiplier and our brackets, and we're going to pass in, so doMaths passes in 22 and 10 to here. Then we're going to pass in those numbers again, arg1, arg2, and we're going to pass in those numbers from this argument to multiplier. So if now I do console.log in the multiplier, and let's do arg1 and see if we are getting arg1, there we are, 22. So 22 is going from doMaths into the doMaths function, then it's passed into the multiplier function, and we're console logging it. Great. So what we can do instead is we can return arg1 multiplied by arg2. Now if I save this, you're not going to get anything because we're not consoling it out. We're not console logging it out. So what we could do here, we could save what is returned from the multiplier into a variable. So let's say var sum from multiplier. Now if I save that now, we've still got nothing. But if I console log sum from multiplier, you can see it's given us our sum now. So this function has done its job and has just sent the results back here to be stored in this variable. Perfect. Right, so now we're going to create another function. So just underneath multiplier, I'm going to call it function adder. And it's going to have 3 arguments. And we can call these whatever we want again. And what this is going to do is going to return just them all added together. So the original arg1, the original arg2, and the sum of the function above it, so arg3. And what we're going to do again is we're going to create a variable to store that returned value. So var sum, and we can call this whatever we want, sum from adder. And we're basically saying run this adder function here, pass in arg1, arg2, and sum from multiplier, right? So we're saying run this adder function, we're going to give it arg1, arg2, and sum from multiplier, which is, remember, the return from this function here. So I want to store the return of adder in this variable. Then we can say console.log sum from adder, so give us the return of that. And if you notice, we made a mistake. We said return arg1, 2, 3. That won't work. So we need to arg1 plus arg2 plus arg3. Give it a return 252. So that's an example of using return statements and getting functions to do very specific tasks, then consolidating them in one function. Okay, so now let's look at a real world example. So if you didn't start with this file, you can see the link in the description for the starter file. And what we can say is, in our index.html, we have a number, id equals number, id equals multiply, ID equals submit, and an ID equals result. So we're going to pick these up in the JavaScript. So we're going to say var number. We want that to be document.get element by ID. And this is saying get an element from the page and get it by its ID name. And the ID we want to get is number. Now I'm just going to copy this a few times. And we want the checkbox. So we're going to call it checkbox, our variable. And I know that that name is multiply, as an ID of multiply. Then submit button, which had an ID of submit. And the result, which was that paragraph tag with the ID of result. So now we have all our elements on the page. What we can do is we can create a function called doMaths. And we want to run this function when that submit button is clicked. So first of all, let's get the number. So create a variable called var_num, which is equal to the number dot value. Right? So we're getting the value of the input field with dot value. That's how you get it in JavaScript. Now we're going to say if the checkbox dot checked, so checkbox is what we called it, dot checked comes from JavaScript for us. So it checks if it's checked. So if the checkbox is checked, we want to return the number variable above multiplied by 2, because we're using that checkbox as a multiplier and we're returning that. If else, we're just going to return the number without it being multiplied. So if the checkbox is checked, multiply it by 2. If not, we're just going to return the normal number. We need to run this function. If I press save now, it's not doing anything. Now we need to run this function when we are clicked. So we're going to say submit button dot add event listener. And this is how we create a click event. And we call it a click. So brackets click. After the quotes, we're going to do a comma, function, parentheses, curly brackets. So submit.add event listener, brackets, click in quotes, comma, function, open and close brackets, then curly brackets. Then what we want to say is we want to say result. So the result up here, which is that paragraph tag on the page. You see this paragraph here. Get the result element on the page and .text content. And this is another thing in JavaScript. It basically says we're going to change the text content of this element. And because we're returning values from the doMaths, we can say doMaths, parentheses, semicolon. So we're calling doMaths here, and we're changing the text content of result. I'm going to semicolon right at the end to finish it off. And when I save, what happens now if I go 1, 1, and hit submit, we get 11 here. If I multiply, hit submit, goes to 22. And we can update this and carry on going. So every time we click, this is what happens. We click and it runs this function here, which changes the text content with the doMaths function. So that is a real world example of why and how we would use a function. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next part of JavaScript Basics.